Lincoln, Slavery, and the Civil War, Lecture 1. In the last few lectures, we talked about the Dred Scott decision and about Lincoln's retort to the Dred Scott decision. And at the core of his response to the Dred Scott decision was his claim that the founders could be, on the one hand, morally opposed to the institution of slavery, and yet at the same time still tolerate its existence if they believed that there was no safe way consistent with the common good to abolish it. So that's where we left off. Now, in these readings that we move on to, I wanted to say more about Lincoln's approach to the question of slavery. I mentioned the core of it in the last lecture, which is, you might say that Lincoln had a two-step strategy, which I don't think was that different from the founders, but it was a two-step strategy. The first step of that strategy is do not allow slavery to expand any further as an institution. Contain it to where it already exists. And then, over time, find ways to abolish it. Right? And this is all based on a clear recognition that slavery ought to be abolished, and that the way to do it is to restrict it first and foremost as you find a way to get rid of it. So the readings that I had you do for this time, you had some selections from his House Divided speech, his debates, his campaign debate, last one with Stephen Douglas, and then also some selections from his first inaugural and the Gettysburg Address. And so I wanted to lay out more Lincoln's approach to all of this so that you understand it. Now, the House Divided speech, this is on page 154 of your packet. This speech was his acceptance speech for the nomination as the Republican Party's candidate for senator in Illinois in 1858. And his major opponent in the election was Stephen Douglas, who was a Northern Democrat. Douglas, as you might recall, was trying to diffuse the slavery controversy of the time through his doctrine of pop sov, or popular sovereignty. Let each state decide for itself whether to be slave or free, and don't make slavery a national issue. Right? If one state wants to abolish slavery, fine. If another one wants to have it, fine. This is what federalism is for. Let the states disagree. Now, some Republicans, right? So remember, the Republican Party had grown out of the ashes of the Whig Party and with defectors from the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was really the anti-slavery party, and it had fairly recently formed in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the fallout from that. Even though Stephen Douglas was the author of this hated Kansas-Nebraska Act, that is, it was hated by Republicans, nonetheless, some Republicans in 1858 were thinking that the Republican Party should actually support Douglas, that they should embrace Douglas. And the reason why is this, that everybody knew that Douglas was planning on running for president in 1860. And they knew, these Republicans who were sympathetic with Douglas, they knew that because of Pop Sov, Douglas was not reliably anti-slavery in the way that, say, Lincoln was. He was not wholeheartedly opposed to it. Nonetheless, he was wholeheartedly supportive of the rights of individual states to abolish slavery within their territory. So he wasn't pro-slavery either. He was kind of, neither pro nor con. But what the Republicans thought is, even though Douglas was maybe a little bit wobbly on the slavery issue, nonetheless, he was much more electable than somebody such as Lincoln was. They thought that Douglas had a much broader national appeal and therefore was a much more likely as a candidate to win the presidency than somebody such as Lincoln. And they thought, well, even if he's not as reliably anti-slavery as somebody like Lincoln, he's certainly not pro-slavery. And so maybe we should throw our support behind him so that he is elected president rather than somebody who is more supportive of slavery. Right. So the idea is we're going to choose Douglas as the lesser of two evils. So I say we should get behind him now in 1858 in order to help propel him in 1860 to the presidency, and prevent there from being somebody elected president in 1860 who was really pro-slavery. And I would note, by the way, that Douglas was himself against any notion that the Dred Scott decision implied that free states had to allow people to bring slaves into them. Remember, this was the implication that a lot of people were worried about when Tawney had said that the federal government does not have the right to prevent people from taking slaves as property into the territories. Some people thought this was just one step on the way to a future decision, which would say that states were not allowed to prohibit people from bringing their slaves across state borders, which would in effect legalize slavery everywhere. Somebody who lived in Alabama and had slaves could take them all to Massachusetts and reside there. That was the fear. And Douglas was adamantly against this. And so that's why a number of prominent Republicans were willing to back Douglas. But nonetheless, in this internal debate within the Republican Party, in the end, the Republicans nominated Lincoln. They ended up choosing Lincoln as their man. Lincoln campaigned against Douglas, and he lost. Douglas won the election in 1858 and became senator of Illinois. But nonetheless, even though he lost, in this process, Lincoln makes a real name for himself, a national name for himself. And it has been argued in history books, and I think this is probably right, that Lincoln didn't think really that he could win against Douglas. But he wanted to make sure that even while losing, he made it as plain as day that popular sovereignty, was not a viable solution to the problem of slavery, because it would allow slavery to expand on a state-by-state basis. Now, you can imagine the appeal that Stephen Douglas had at this time. The United States was divided, really, against itself over the issue of slavery. The issue kept coming up, and it stirred up sectional conflict, resentment. Eventually it leads to civil war. It was a nationally explosive issue. And even though national politicians frequently tried to find ways to, in effect, put the genie back in the bottle to try to avoid the issue, the slavery issue kept popping up and kept getting more heated and more heated. And Douglas comes along with what might seem like an admirably moderate position. He says, look, let each state decide for itself. Popular sovereignty. Let each state. This doesn't even have to be a national issue, America. Let's just agree to disagree. If the people of one state want to allow slavery, fine, let them. If you in your state don't want to allow slavery, then don't allow it, right? But don't try to tell them not to allow it, and don't let them try to tell you that you have to allow it. Just agree to disagree. This is not a national issue, right? That was Douglas's approach. And you could see how, for people who were, rightfully worried about the future of the country, this might seem like a very appealing solution to the problem. Let's just agree to disagree. But the problem, as Lincoln points out, is that still would allow slavery to expand. If states want to have slavery, Popsov would allow that. And Lincoln makes it very clear in his House divided speech that he does not think that that's a viable approach. And this is just the first paragraph, really, of the whole speech. Right? If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. He's referring to Popsov and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Right? Let each state decide for itself. Hopefully this will put an end to national agitation over slavery. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. And then he lays out what he thinks are the only two real options. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction. Right, that's Lincoln's approach. Contain it, don't let it expand further, and then do what you can over time to abolish it. Or, the other option, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. So in other words, Lincoln thinks, no, a decision has to be made. Either slavery has to be accepted as legitimate everywhere, or it has to be acknowledged as illegitimate and put on the course to extinction everywhere. Now, this, of course, is a claim that Douglas takes issue with in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right, where he says it's disastrous to try to push one solution, and the U.S. can do just fine with an indefinite coexistence of free and slave states. So Douglas rejects the notion that somehow the United States has to make a choice here. He thinks that, in effect, let states decide individually, but we don't need a national choice. Now, some of what Lincoln says in his response to Douglas will be taken up again in his first inaugural address, right? And this is what he says around pages 163 and 164 in your packet about what the real issue is between him and Douglas. And we'll look at that in a moment. But I want to spend a few more minutes in this lecture laying out Douglas's position in a little bit more detail, since Lincoln defines his position against Douglas. Now, the selection from Douglas begins on page 155 of your packet and goes up through 159. And so really, I think you can divide that into two sections, pages 155 through 157, where he mainly lays out his case for Popsov, and then pages 157 to 158 or 159, where Douglas quite vehemently agrees with Tawney and Dred Scott in denying that African Americans were intended to be included in the Declaration's affirmation that all men are created equal. So Douglas claims that Lincoln's House divided stance is a repudiation of the wisdom of the founders, because after all, the founders were the ones who built the divided house. They certainly must have thought it could survive, right? As he says on page 156, I took up Mr. Lincoln's three propositions, etc. First, in regard to his doctrine that this government was in violation of the law of God, which says that a house divided against itself cannot stand, I repudiated it as a slander upon the immortal framers of our Constitution. I then said, I have often repeated, and now again assert, that in my opinion, our government can endure forever, divided into free and slave states, as our fathers made it. Each state having the right to prohibit, abolish, or sustain slavery just as it pleases. This government was made upon the great basis of the sovereignty of the states, the right of each state to regulate its own domestic institutions to suit itself. And that right was conferred with the understanding and expectation that inasmuch as each locality had separate interests, each locality must have different and distinct local and domestic institutions corresponding to its wants and interests. Right? The founders knew well that in a republic as broad as this, having such a variety of soil, climate, and interest, there must necessarily be a corresponding variety of local laws. Right? So in other words, he invokes federalism. He says, no, they built a divided house. They thought it could stand. Now, I would remind you that, what I talked about in an earlier lecture, that the Constitution's compromises with slavery were quite minimal, and there's quite a bit of evidence that, the founders thought that slavery was actually something that should be phased out over time. So it's not clear to me that Douglas is accurately representing the mind of the founders, but, clearly they did build a divided house, although even Lincoln wouldn't deny that. Where Lincoln takes issue with Douglas is what the proper vision for the future of the United States is, whether it will remain divided. Now, Douglas's position on the slavery question was called pop-sov, or popular, short for popular sovereignty, because, to repeat, he held that the people of each state should decide whether or not to allow slavery in their state. Now, the way he puts it is on page, let me find it here. Oh my goodness. Yes, here we go. So on pages 158 and 159, but there's a place where he's talking about slavery, and he says that this is a question that each state must answer for itself. We in Illinois have decided it for ourselves. We tried slavery, kept it up for 12 years, and finding that it was not profitable, we abolished it for that reason and became a free state. He basically says that's what we did. If other states want to do that, fine. If they want to do things a different way, fine too. It's their right to determine how to govern themselves. As he says at the bottom of page 157, I hold there is no power on earth under our system of government which has the right to force a constitution upon an unwilling people. Right? So each people gets to have the constitution that they want. And so he goes on, he kind of ends his speech by saying that, Lincoln, he accuses Lincoln really of being part of a group of ambitious politicians who want to exploit the numerical majority that the North has, electorally speaking, over the South, by using slavery as what we would now call a wedge issue, sort of using the issue of slavery, not because they really cared about it, but because by beating the drum on that issue, they could propel themselves to national prominence and acquire power for themselves. So he presents Lincoln as a kind of self-interested, ambitious politician who just wants to stoke divisions over slavery in order to further his own career. And he presents himself, Douglas presents himself as the friend of mutual conciliation. Right? So that's his approach. Now, in the next lecture, I will talk about his interpretation of the Declaration of Independence and then move on to Lincoln's response to Douglas.